Barry Borden was a volunteer at 16, on active service while still officially underage. Why is he fighting this war?
Well, I feel it's to do something for my country and keep it white, you know, fight the terrorism so we can have a decent country.
I've lived here all my life. Well, this is what I'm fighting for. I'm not going to let somebody take it away from me.
The African country of Rhodesia unilaterally declared its independence from Britain in 1965. Although it had a prime minister and a parliament, Rhodesia's government was never considered legitimate and was never recognized by the United Nations. Rhodesia's government was never legitimate because it lacked the presence of true popular sovereignty. In a country of 6 million blacks and less than 300,000 whites, blacks held very little voting power. Rhodesia was run by a white minority government, not unlike the government of their neighbor, South Africa. The late 1960s and the 1970s was a turbulent time for both African nations. Black nationalist groups had been involved in a guerrilla war with Rhodesia's government since Rhodesia's independence. They sought equal representation in parliament for whites and blacks and were headed by Joseph Nkomo, pictured here on the left, and Robert Mugabe, pictured here on the right. By the mid-1970s, the international community had taken a special notice of the political struggles in southern Africa. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, working through the United Nations, placed economic pressure on Rhodesia in an attempt both to stop the violence and to push its government toward majority rule. In the United States, conservative writers quickly made a connection between the events taking place in the 70s in Rhodesia and the events that had been taking place in the United States since the early 1960s. The writers of The Cross and the Flag, The Citizen, and The Washington Report used the events in Rhodesia and South Africa as a metaphor. They used nearly identical rhetoric in addressing the Southern African situation as they had and did in addressing the American domestic issues of race relations and states' rights in the 1960s and early 1970s. These writers used the Rhodesia metaphor to make several inexplicit connections in the minds of their audience. They made a connection between the United Nations and the U.S. federal government. They made a connection between the white minority in Rhodesia and the conservative movement in the United States. And they made a connection between the fears for Rhodesia's future and their fears for America's future. The existence of this metaphor is based off of three prevalent similarities in rhetoric used both in the conservative opinion on Southern Africa and in their defense of domestic states' rights and segregation. The economic argument against UN intervention in Rhodesia mirrored the conservative argument against forced busing. Both made an appeal to the concerned taxpayer and argued that the cost of integration was unnecessary. For example, a 1976 issue of The Cross and the Flag writes, "Little known is the true cost of the operation. 21,000 of Boston's 67,000 schoolchildren will be bused at an annual cost of $7.6 million. In the same year, a writer for The Citizen utilized the same rhetorical strategy. He wrote, "Carefully unmentioned in the rash of political pronouncements about Kissinger's Rhodesia plan is that it would cost the Rhodesian citizenry from $1 billion to $2.5 billion. The next type of rhetorical similarity that enforces the Rhodesia metaphor was the argument that blacks preferred segregation just as much as whites did. These quotes display the conservative sentiment that blacks and whites alike were better off in a segregated society, and that any further push for civil rights was unnecessary and counterproductive. The third rhetorical similarity that displays these conservative writers' use of the Rhodesia metaphor is their rejection of federalism, whether it takes the form of the federal government or of the United Nations. Conservative writers painted the white government's struggles against the UN as uniquely patriotic and American, thereby implying that the United Nations was an oppressor and the antithesis of American values. This was intended as a reinforcement of their existing dislike of federalism, which was acquired from the onslaught of federally enforced social programs under Johnson's Great Society. By contending that the United Nations was blatantly overreaching its bounds in placing an economic vice grip on Rhodesia, conservative writers were really offering a critique of the concept of federalism as a whole, and especially as it had been seen in the United States. In conclusion, the conservative writers of the mid-1970s saw the events of Southern Africa as a metaphor for several dynamics in U.S. domestic politics. When they looked upon the United Nations, they were really witnessing the impending tyranny of their own federal government. When they witnessed the response on the white minority governments in South Africa and Rhodesia, they were really focusing on the attack on American conservative culture that was the 1960s. When they displayed concern for the future of Rhodesia, they were really providing a testimony to their anger with and fear of a liberal American future. The identical rhetoric between these writers' opinion of race relations and states' rights and their contentions on Rhodesia and South Africa display the 1970s conservative writers' intent and belief in the Rhodesia Metaphor.